There. Now can you hear me? Okay, good.
She could read lips, though.
Yeah, she could read lips. Very good. Let me adjust this down a little bit. Now, it took over a little over an hour on Tuesday and Wednesday, so I got to talk a little bit fast. But I will still take questions if you want. Today's topic is Noah's flood. And I would have to say that this is probably one of the more common objections to the truth of the Bible. You Christians don't really believe that the entire world was flooded so that all the mountains were covered? You really believe that? Yes, we do. But that is a very common objection that's out there. So, first of all, bottom of page 69, chapter 8. Was Noah's flood a true worldwide event? Right at the bottom. There are over 270 flood accounts today on major world continents. Now, this isn't a major proof of the flood. However, this is some contributing evidence. If you turn the page 70, just a couple of examples of it I think are interesting. That middle paragraph there, the Hawaiians tell of one good man and his family who survived the flood that covered the whole earth, that killed all the wicked people. The man's name was Nu'u. Oh, yeah, that sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? And then down one more line, the Chinese have a similar account, but more specific. The man's name was Fuhi, and he, along with his wife, 3 sons and 3 daughters, survived a flood that covered the highest mountains on earth. Now, yes, the Chinese account says daughters, but you can call a son-in-law a son or a daughter-in-law a daughter. That's not an issue. So very similar to what we know, right? And then a couple lines farther down, the Toltecs of Mexico state that the world lasted 1,716 years before being destroyed by a worldwide flood that covered even the highest mountains. So there are a lot of accounts, 270 by Pastor Ollis's counting, of various stories about a worldwide flood. Now, would all of these different cultures have this in their cultural history if it weren't somehow based on truth? Again, it's not a major proof for the truth of Noah's flood, but it is some contributing evidence. By the way, we call it Noah's flood. Did Noah own it? It's not really his flood, is it? I just find that humorous that we always say Noah's flood, but it's really God's flood and Noah's ark. But it's not even that. It's God's ark too, right? All right, page 71, some of the more specific questions about Noah's ark and the flood. The second paragraph there, third line down. Do we have enough water on the planet to do this? The answer is yes, there is actually enough water in the oceans for covering the earth 1.7 miles deep if all the mountains were leveled and the sea valleys were filled in. In other words, if the planet were as smooth as a billiard ball, there's enough water to cover the earth 1.7 miles deep all over. There is sufficient water. Now, of course, the earth is not as smooth as a billiard ball. However, before the flood, it was smoother than it is now. Okay? So think about this. God created one giant supercontinent. Yes, we believe there was a Pangea that occurred, which a lot of geologic scientists say, well, look how North and South America fit so nicely right around Africa and Europe. Yeah, we believe that too. And God created one continent, and during the catastrophe that is the flood, the continent got ripped apart. And in the process of ripping it apart, the ocean valleys got dug a little deeper, and the mountains got pushed a little bit higher as the geologic plates were being torn apart and rammed together during the catastrophe, okay? So there would have been mountains and seafloor during before Noah's flood, but they wouldn't have been as deep nor as high. We don't really know how high. But even so, 1.7 miles deep, that's a lot of water all around the world, okay? So there is enough water. Okay, let's go on. Next page. Right at the top on page 70, meteorologists raise another interesting objection to a worldwide flood. We don't have enough cloud cover to get rain to fall for 40 days and 40 nights to flood the earth. That's a valid point, but not what Scripture says. According to Genesis 7:11, on that day, all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened. Most of the water came from underground rivers, underground springs, that type of thing. Plus, there was more cloud cover back then, or more atmosphere back then than we would realize today. So let me briefly explain this. This is a slight aside. When on day 2 of creation, God separated the waters below from the waters above, right? So he created the seas on day 2 of creation. The waters above were the firmament, or the atmosphere that surrounded the earth. Now that atmosphere was much thicker and more beneficial to life. One thing is, it provided an insulator from cosmic rays. It also provided a little bit of a greenhouse effect, so that the temperatures underneath that firmament were more ideal, closer to ideal than they are now. They would not have had the wide temperature swings like we have around the world today, okay? So it would have created that. It would have held in the oxygen, so there was a higher level of oxygen in the air prior to Noah's flood. All of those factors, and a couple of more that I didn't even mention, would mean that life could survive for longer periods of time. Remember how long people lived prior to Noah's flood? Anywhere from 700 to 900 years. The oldest person was Methuselah, 969 years. Noah himself lived to over Adam lived to over 900 years. After Noah's flood, how long did people live? 120 years. That was the maximum, or less. What do we live today? You know, on average, 80, 90 years, maybe into our hundreds, a few people. Maybe, you generally hear the oldest person on earth at any point in time is like 110 or 112. That 120 number or less, that still applies today. That's after Noah's flood. Well, part of what happened is God collapsed that firmament. So that's where the rain came from. There would have been a lot more rain back then at that moment than there would be in our experience today.
You know, all those questions about it are all based on, I can't figure this out in my mind, so therefore I don't believe it.
Yeah, that's right.
Forget that God
That's right.
can
A lot of these objections that throughout this whole class, I can't figure it out, so therefore it must not be. Yeah, you're exactly right. So there would have been more rain at that time. However, the Bible clearly says that most of the water came from underneath. It came from the underground rivers, the underground springs. God is ripping apart the continent into subcontinents, so, continents as we know today, and water is gushing up. And as the continents are ripping apart, what's happening to the oceans? They're sloshing back and forth like water in a bucket that you're swinging, and the water's splashing over and then it's rising. So it would have been a great time of catastrophe at that time. Very scary time as well. All right.
Everybody died. Noah's family.
Yeah, everybody died. Everything died. Right. Absolutely. All right. So the next one, let's see, where are we on that was page 72. Page 73. Children's books and Noah's Ark toys often lead to another objection. How did all the animals fit in there? Genesis 6 gives us the dimensions. The ark was 450 feet long by 75 feet wide by 45 feet high. If any of you have been to the Noah's Ark exhibit down by the Creation Museum, and yes, I still plan on scheduling a trip for anyone who wants to go, not just youth, families, seniors, whoever wants to go, sometime this summer when it's safe. But if you see it, Noah's Ark was quite big. It's bigger than you think. And I remember for a children's message quite some time ago, just to give the kids a little bit of scale, I looked at our parking lot out here and I measured it. And our parking lot portion, not the driveway up along the building, but past the little green spot, so the parking area, that is 80 feet wide. And if you look at the length of our parking lot from where the curve comes in and the parking begins, right at the beginning, now it's narrower there, but if you go from that point to where the parking lot goes out into the exit driveway, that's about 500 feet. So roughly, that's the footprint of the ark. And then you go 45 feet high, which in modern terms would be about 4 stories. Now Noah built it with 3 decks. That's what God told him to do. So in his case, it would have been 3 stories, but they would have been high, tall stories. So, think of 45 feet high, the footprint of our parking lot. That's quite big, and 3 decks inside. Secondly, look at the middle of that paragraph. How is this possible? According to Woodmarat, at most 16,000 animals were needed to preserve the created kinds God had made originally. However, other creation scientists have estimated the number of creatures to be approximately 35,000. Whether it's 16,000 or 35,000, it's not as many as people think. Okay? So somewhere between 16,000 and 35,000 kinds of animals. Let's see if can I minimize this okay and call up something on the screen?
They're not gonna see it until you share it.
Yeah, I'll share it. Okay, so let me go back to this. Oh no, enlarge, share screen, this. Okay, there, is it being shared?
Yep.
All right. Remember this level of classification? This is a modern way to classify animals. Domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. So one of the objections to Noah's flood is that you can't fit all the species on the ark. Well, you can't, that's true. Noah wasn't fitting all the species on the ark. He was fitting all the families on the ark. The Bible calls them kinds. Noah had to take 2 of every kind of animal. Well, one family is called the feline family. And what is feline? Cats. And there's the canine family, that's dogs. And there's the equine family, that's horses. Did Noah need 2 of every cat species or cat breed or dog breed? No, he just needed 2. And out of those 2, you know how breeders work, and you can breed various characteristics by having, a mommy cat and a daddy cat together and mating certain ways, and over a couple of generations, you can breed various characteristics for cats and dogs, or horses, or anything else. So Noah just needed 2 of every kind, which would be the equivalent of family. So that's where some creation scientists have counted up all the known families of animals in the world, and one of them got 16,000 and another one got 35,000. Either number works because you could easily fit them on the ark.
Well, God saw to it that these animals showed up at the ark anyway, did he?
Right.
God made the decision of.
That's right. God decided the animal. God gave the animals at that time an instinct or an urge to go to Noah. So he didn't have to go out and capture all these animals. All of a sudden they start showing up, and that I would suppose that would be a sign to Noah. Well, I guess God's going to start the flood pretty soon. I better start loading the animals. So think of that that way. So there's an easy explanation for that. Okay, stop share. There we are. Back to this.
They didn't have to be full grown either.
Correct. They did not have to be. In fact, they wouldn't have been, because as soon as they came off the ark, they would have started reproducing, procreating, having young. So God would have sent to Noah younger animals, right? Animals that were just, well, in human terms, we would say have just gone through puberty. You know, we're that teenage years. And that, by the way, next week we're going to talk about dinosaurs. And one question is, were there dinosaurs on the ark? How would they fit? Well, they were young. They were small. They were, early in life. So, pardon?
Excellent.
Yeah, right. Okay, the bottom of page 73. A ship research study found that the dimensions of the ark were the most seaworthy of 12 ship models tested, combining comfort, stability, and strength. As a matter of fact, the ark's design is so strong that it could handle waves as high as 100 feet. Another study found the ark's configuration almost impossible to capsize. I remember reading some additional on this, and other naval architects have studied, and the dimensions of the ark is ideal to prevent to be capsized. Now, it's very hard to steer. It's very hard to propel an object that big, but Noah didn't need to steer it. He didn't need to propel it, right? He just needed to float. And so God gave him dimensions that created an ideal boat size that would be the most difficult to capsize. And of course it didn't capsize, but it was huge. So that was part of it too. All right, turn the page, 74. But even with sufficient space for people, food, and animals, how did Noah and the others care for the animals during the flood? since they were on board for a little over a year. We know that from the Bible. Wasn't that an overwhelming task? First, we have to remember that the creatures came to Noah. Okay, we already mentioned that. Next, in response to the dark confines of a rocking ship, many animals may have gone into hibernation. Yeah, any of you ever pull that trick on your toddlers when they were not going to sleep at night? So you put them in the car and you drive around the block? And what happens? They fall asleep. Yeah, right. It still happens today for me when Jill's driving. And she does it too when I'm driving. So yeah, you know, there's that gentle rocking motion of the car. All of the animals that were subject to hibernate, like bears and, you know, reptiles, etc., they likely would have all gone into hibernation. So first of all, a big chunk of the animals would not have needed constant care. Secondly, many of the animals, you know, again, a very short side story. We just adopted 2 kittens in our family. We also have a dog. Dogs and cats eat differently, don't they? If you feed a dog, how much does it eat? Till the food's gone.
Yeah,
Right. If you feed a cat, how much does it eat?
what it needs.
Yeah, what it needs, or until it's not hungry, and then it walks away and leaves the rest there. Most animals are more like a cat. You know, I'm thinking like horses. You go see horses at the youth fair, and you know they have a bin of hay there, and the horse eats as much as it needs, and the rest stays there for later in the day or the next day. So first of all, a big chunk of the animals go into hibernation. Secondly, another chunk of the animals, you only need to feed and water them every few days. So yes, Noah's got to make rounds. He and his family, they're making rounds throughout the ark, feeding and watering the animals. That's true. So there would have been something to do. I don't think Noah would have been bored. He would have had work. All right, and then it says right below that on page 74, with basic devices such as watering system and food dispensers. You know, no doubt he might have had a trough built along the floor where he could just dump some water in and it would run down the length of a bunch of stalls, and it would water all the animals, or at least the animals in that row, all at once. So Noah was smart enough to do that kind of thing. All right, bottom of page 74. The idea of the ark floating on a planet totally submerged is the biggest objection people have to the flood account. Usually, skeptics say Noah's flood was local in scope. However, what did God say? Top of page 75. For behold, I will bring a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh. If Noah's flood was only local, and this is a common argument, well, it might have been a flood, but it was just in the Middle East only. It was just localized, just kind of around the Mediterranean. That was it. Well, God said, I will destroy all flesh. That wouldn't destroy all flesh. The only way to do that is a worldwide flood. And then down at the bottom of page 75, one of the best arguments against a local flood is the promise God made to Noah. When I bring clouds over the earth and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. And the waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. What is that a reference to? Rainbow, right? Rainbow is the sign of God's covenant that he will never destroy the world again through a flood. Now, if the flood were localized, do we still have local floods here and there around the world throughout time? Yeah, sometimes somewhat widespread. Was it last year or the year before that the upper Midwest had a rather widespread flood that like the, some of the upper Mississippi River flooded, and there was in Iowa, it was underwater, big chunk of Iowa was underwater, all of that. Well, if God said, I will never again flood the earth, and here's a rainbow to prove it, and the flood were only local, well, then God broke that promise, didn't he? Because he still makes local floods happen. So if Noah's flood were local, that promise makes no sense. So again, there's also some scientific support behind the idea of the flood being a worldwide flood. We'll get to that in just a moment. Page 76. If only 8 people survived the flood, how did mankind originate from Noah's family? Or some will say it this way: how did we get all the races? Actually, there is only one race, the human race. I remember the very first time I visited the Creation Museum with the youth that I was with at the time. So this is about 10 years ago. I was fascinated by that. They had a display that was talking about that. There's not all these races. There's one race, the human race. And we as Christians, you know, all the hubbub that's going on about racism in our culture right now. Now, some of it, yes, is overblown and, you know, whatever, it's being politicized. Some of it is true. We as Christians are on the forefront of being against racism because we're all one race. There's not all these different races, right? Skin color is just a different melatonin in your skin. We're all humans. So the question, using the word races in the modern day sense, meaning people of different ethnicity or skin color, how could that happen from Noah and his family? Well, if you remember genetics, I know when I was in biology in high school that we had this lesson in biology class about, I think, some monk in Australia who did some genetic experimenting with peas, sweet. You guys remember that at all, or am I like, no? Yeah, maybe. Okay, so one or two hot heads nodding. But anyway, and it was kind of the beginning of genetic experimentation or genetic discovery. And so if you take Noah and his wife, and they have, I'm oversimplifying it, 2 genes each. They have a gene for dark skin and a gene for light skin. And Noah's wife has a gene for dark skin and a gene for light skin. And so they themselves, having 1 gene of each, what color skin do they have? Medium skin. Think about Middle Eastern people. They generally have kind of a medium skin. They're neither light skin nor dark skin, right? So if Noah's kids inherit 1 gene from each parent, and they inherit a dark skin from Noah and a dark skin from Mrs. Noah, what color would they be? Dark skinned. If they inherit a light skin and a light skin gene, they would be light skin. And if they inherit a dark skin from one and a light skin from the other, or light skin from one and a dark skin from the other, they're going to be medium skin. It's just an exercise in genetics. Just like you can get, you know, hundreds of breeds of dogs from one pair of dogs that are kind of what we would call today mutts, that carry all the different variations of genes within that parent pair of dogs, and then you can get all the breeds out of that. Same thing with Noah and his wife. They had all the different genes for all the different skin types, and out of that, then, you know, over time, over a few generations, would come all the different, what we call today races, although that's a bit of a misnomer because we're all one race. Okay, does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. But, I mean, you could even expand upon that, right, because it was Noah and his family,
Mm-hmm.
was it just his kids, or were his kids, like, married?
Right, his kids were married, so his sons and his wives, their wives, yeah.
There's probably some other, the
Right.
chance of some other nationality.
Right, so there's actually 8 starting points for a pool of genes. Right, right. Yeah, exactly. Ellen?
Some years ago, they used to talk about how one of Noah's sons was the father of the black race or something.
Yeah, it's often thought,
Yeah.
and there's some hint of it in the Bible, that Noah's sons split up, and one moved south, one moved north, and one kind of stayed put. And so the thought is the one that moved south, you know, ended up in Africa. And what happens in Africa? Well, you're under the hot sun a lot, so people with darker melanin in their skin would be more able to survive, would last. Those with lighter skin might move back north again because it's too hot for them. So yes, there is some thought that one of Noah's sons was kind of the father of the darker skinned race, the darker skinned people in Africa. One is the lighter skinned people that went to Europe, and the other one was staying there in the Middle East. Yeah, we don't know exactly, but there is some hint at that. Yeah. Okay?
I had one other question.
Yeah.
I've never heard really an explanation about aquatic animals.
Oh, yeah. It does say that God destroyed all air-breathing animals. So on the ark, Noah would have had land animals and birds, but no fish. So the fish would have just remained in the ocean. And yes, I think prior to Noah's flood, the saltiness of the water would have been much less salty. So there would have been a mixture of freshwater and saltwater marine animals. And then after the flood is when they would start separating themselves out, because the saltiness of the seas increased due to runoff from the salt on the land. So as the saltiness of the seas increased and the inland lakes did not get saltier, so then saltwater creatures in inland lakes would die, freshwater fish in the seas would die. And so then you end up with that division of salt and freshwater. Does that make sense?
Yes, except for like, you would include the mammals in there, that the aquatic mammals and stuff, but that.
Aquatic mammals.
You know, the dolphins.
Yeah, I guess I would. I guess I would. So they are air breathing.
Yeah.
You know, I've never really thought about that, because God does say everything that has the breath of life in it, I will destroy,
Yeah.
other than what's on the ark. Well, most fish don't breathe air directly. They, you know, just kind of filter out oxygen from the water in their gills. But there are a few air-breathing marine animals. You're right. I don't know. I don't have an answer. You stumped me. I don't think Noah would have had a whale or a dolphin on the ark.
Yeah.
So somehow they remained in the ocean, and it makes you wonder about what God said about the breath of life.
That's right.
Okay. All right. Bottom of page 76. A final objection raised to the worldwide flood is often stated comically. How did the kangaroos get to Australia? In other words, how did animals migrate all over the continents? This is a legitimate question that can be answered just as legitimately by the use of land bridges. We already know today that scientists pretty much think and have traced the migration of animals from Asia across the Bering Straits into Americas, North and South America, right? And have you ever wondered, maybe you haven't until now, there's a wide range of wildlife in Africa and Asia. You know, they have tigers and elephants. There's an African elephant, an Asian elephant, tigers, you know, all kinds of strange and exotic animals. We have a much narrower range of wild animals in North and South America, don't we? Yes, because only certain animals made the trip up into Northeast Asia, across the Bering Straits, and then down into the Americas. They just would have migrated across that land bridge. Same thing is true down for Australia. Between Southeast Asia and Australia, what do you find? All kinds of islands. And the seafloor in that area is not as deep as it is out in the middle of the Pacific. So maybe at a certain point in time, the seafloor was shallower, or they might have done a lot of island hopping. And so the animals could have, you know, they float on a log and get from one island, and then they can swim across to the next. And eventually they kind of migrate down through all those islands, and they end up in Australia. Okay. So it's really not hard to understand, although people do make that objection. Well, how did the kangaroos get to Australia? All right.
Well, it's possible that the land hadn't split immediately. It might have been closer.
Well, there might have been maybe partial rifts or something, and so the animals come off the ark, and then some of them go to what would become Australia, and it kept drifting out after they're already on it, right? That's kind of what you're saying, that the continuation of the continental drift after Noah comes off the ark. That could be, yeah, absolutely, that could be.
Well, the animals that are like lions and tigers and stuff could not have gone across the Bering Straits because they're not cold weather.
Yeah, they can't survive cold.
Yeah.
Right, absolutely. All right, page 77, geological implications of the flood. All right, 4 main geologic evidences for the flood. This is the last paragraph on 77. First, fossils of sea creatures are found high above sea level on every continent, amazingly even the Himalayas of Nepal. This is a very easy scientific evidence that can't be disputed. And this is one that I generally mention to kids when they ask me these questions. Because you can find fossils of sea creatures and shellfish of various sorts, even at the tops of mountains. The Himalayas, the Alps, the Rockies. How could you have fossils of marine creatures near the tops of all these mountains if the entire earth wasn't covered by water? You couldn't. So there is some proof that you can't explain unless you believe in Noah's flood. Page 78 at the bottom. A second geologic evidence for the flood was the rapid burial of billions of plants and animals all over the planet. This is what you would expect to find in a global catastrophe such as the flood. Quick, how do you make a fossil? Good question. In order to produce a fossil, you need a rapid burial in the right soil conditions with extreme pressures. Without these 3 considerations, organisms will decay and not be preserved. One of the pictures on one of your handouts shows a fish eating another fish. How long does it take a fish to eat a fish? 5 seconds? 10 seconds? How could that fish eating another fish be fossilized if it wasn't rapidly buried in that exact moment? Because otherwise it would have finished its dinner. Okay, so there is evidence that most of the fossils occurred through rapid burial. All right? Long periods of time have nothing to do with producing a fossil. I remember at the Creation Museum, they found a fossil of a backpack in Australia. A backpack. Some kid had dropped it in a mudslide, it got rapidly buried, and in a matter of a decade, it turned to stone. You can create fossils in quick order if they're rapidly buried in mud and then dried out. It's not hard. So that's the second geologic evidence. Turn the page 80. A third geologic evidence for the flood is that sediment layers, sometimes miles deep, are spread across vast areas and deposited rapidly. One example is the Grand Canyon in Arizona. The rock layers exposed in the canyon walls belong to 6 very thick, distinctive sequences of sedimentary rock layers that can be traced across the entire continent of North America. I don't know if he says it right here or if it's on one of those handouts, but you can find a certain type of sandstone at a certain depth in the Grand Canyon, and the same sandstone is at the same depth in Pennsylvania. So there's these layers of rock that cover the entire continent. Now, how could that happen unless the entire continent were covered and recovered with mud in layers in rapid order? Same thing is true, and I don't know, again, if it's here or if it's on that handout, but the chalk cliffs in Dover, England. Very famous, right? It's a layer of chalk. You find that same layer of chalk at the same depth across Europe. Now, how would you find that same type of rock, across an entire continent if it wasn't laid down all together at once over the entire continent? Okay. Number 4, page 80, bottom paragraph. A fourth geologic evidence for the flood is that rock layers were laid down in quick succession with rapid or no erosion between them. And he goes on down in the middle, he talks about folded rock layers. You remember our folded rock layers? Let me call up my picture. So let me go back. I'm going to close this one. Rock layers, bent rock. Okay, there we go.
Sure.
All right, go back to this. Share screen. Bent rock layers. There we go. Is that on the screen? There's no way you could have those layers bend like that, all in parallel, unless they were all laid down in rapid succession and they were all still wet and pliable before they dried out, and then some cataclysm caused that bump up in the rock there, and then they all go around in that same curve. And if you think about it, evolutionists will say, well, each of those layers is 1,000 years old. Well, then you'd have one layer that might be bent, then all the rest would kind of be on the flat spots, right? They wouldn't follow the bend. You can find these bent rock layer phenomenon all over the world, including in the Grand Canyon. In fact, when we were there as a family on a family vacation, and we hiked just a part way down the Grand Canyon. How far down did we go, Elliot? About an hour and a half? I mean, it's a full day to get down to the bottom. We didn't do that, but we got. And we're walking down there, and having already been to the Creation Museum and having read a lot of this, I'm walking down there and I'm seeing spots right on the hiking trails where the layers of rock are going like this. And I start talking out loud. See, right there, that's Noah's flood. And Jill's, shh, somebody might hear you. I don't want to be embarrassed. Because all of the displays and the commentary that you see, the Grand Canyon is millions of years old. And I'm talking out loud to the sign saying, no, that's wrong. And Jill's getting embarrassed. Sorry, Jill. It's true. You know it's true. All right.
Unshare.
Oh, yeah, unshare. Okay, I'll stop share. There we go. We good? Back on the screen? All right, page 81, arc sightings. Now, again, this is maybe some more minor evidence in favor of the ark, but it's still some evidence. Besides geologic evidences of the flood, some believe there is physical evidence of the ark still available to be examined. Genesis 8:4 tells us, and in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. Now, their names certainly change sometimes, but there is a Mount Ararat in Turkey, modern day Turkey. It's very high. It's got a permanent glacier on top. And there have been various people who have claimed to have seen buried underneath the glacier that they can see there's some kind of wooden boat structure under there. And there's been a number of sightings that would claim that. Well, could that be? Apparently, the mountain is such that it's extremely difficult to climb. It's only climbable for like a month every year, like in August or whenever it's warm enough that the weather clears. Further, it's constantly surrounded by political turmoil. And though the Muslim country of Turkey doesn't want those Christians poking around our mountain. So stay off our mountain. So it's very hard to verify if the ark is still there. Does it matter to us if the ark is there or not? No. If it were there, yeah, that'd be neat. Hey, that'd lend even more support, some very definite support, but it doesn't really matter. So with that notion, let me go to the handouts. Well, I've got my copy right here. The first one I want to mention is that very thing, the sightings. So there's one that says, let me find it. Oh, it's the back side of one, or it's the one that says eyewitness accounts with the number 2 on it. Eyewitness accounts, okay? So it comes from a book called Searching for Noah's Ark by Dr. John D. Morris. And you see on the right-hand side there, table of eyewitness accounts. There's about 20 eyewitnesses who claim they have seen a portion of the ark sticking out of the glacier. I find it interesting that about half of them are Americans. Isn't that interesting? So, as recently as 1989, a Turkish anthropologist says he saw Noah's Ark. Well, could be. I don't know. All right, flip side of that page. Turn it over. On the left side, you'll see there's a chart listing over 200 flood legends in various cultures around the world. And 95% of them claim the flood was global. The flood was global. 88% of them say there was a favored family or individual who was saved in a boat. Okay? I mean, there's some great similarity here among all these cultures. How would they know about it unless they all descended from Noah and passed down through their oral history? It's interesting, I think, you look at the bottom of that. Was the rainbow mentioned? Only 7% of them mentioned a rainbow. That's kind of interesting. I would have thought that would be more important in all of these cultures that mention the flood, but apparently not. They don't care about the rainbow. An interesting little tidbit there, there's Chinese. You know, Chinese is a language of pictographs. There's like, 2,000 letters in it because every letter is actually a picture depicting the word. Maybe you guys didn't know that, but that's true for Chinese. I had a cousin, her husband was transferred, working for the auto companies, transferred to Japan for 3 years to work on a joint venture with another auto company. And so they learned Japanese, which is similar to Chinese. A lot of pictographs. Well, the pictograph letter in Chinese for vessel is ship plus 8 plus people. You combine those 3 pictographs in the Chinese language and you have the Chinese character for vessel. That's kind of interesting, isn't it? 8 people? It's right there in Chinese culture. And there's, on the other side is a picture, another artist's depiction of the Noah's Ark. Now the one that they rebuilt, the replica, which is 2 scale size, the one they built down by the Creation Museum, they have pointy ends on it. Do they have pointy ends or square ends? We don't know. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. I kind of think Noah probably had the wherewithal and the knowledge to put pointy ends on it so that it would break through the waves a little better rather than flat ends. But either way, it would have been a seaworthy vessel. So, and you'll notice too on that little depiction, it says right there in that footnote, able to carry about 125,000 sheep-sized animals. Most animals are the size of sheep or smaller. Yes, some are bigger, horses, elephants, baby dinosaurs, etc. But most are the size of sheep and smaller. How many animals do creation scientists estimate Noah would have had?
Up to 30,000.
Between 16 and 35,000. There's clearly enough space on the ark. Okay, that's that handout. You can look at that through your in your leisure.
This looks more like a hotel than a boat.
It looks more like a hotel and a boat, that depiction right there. Yeah, maybe it does.
But he
Okay.
wasn't planning to go anywhere, so he didn't need to sail on the.
Yeah, he didn't need to actually move. He just needed to float.
Right.
Okay, this one that says evidence of the flood of Noah, this one, real quickly, briefly. This one I got off the internet. You can see in the header, there's the web page. Evidence for the flood of Noah, number 1, sea creatures buried high in mountains of the continents. I already mentioned that. I think that's a very easy one to understand, even for children. Evidence for the flood of Noah, number 2, rapidly buried plants and animals. And there's the picture of the fossil of one fish eating another fish. There also is a picture, there is also a fossil of an animal giving birth. How long does it take to give birth? I don't know, hour? How long does it take an animal? It's different, I guess. Deb could tell us, she works there, right? Sometimes a long time, yeah. But an animal giving birth would have had to be buried really rapidly, right at that moment, say within the hour, if it takes an hour for an animal to give birth. I don't know. Evidence for the flood of Noah, number 3, rapidly deposited sediment layers across the continents. We already talked about this. You can find the same limestone in the Grand Canyon at the same depth as in Pennsylvania. Okay, evidence for the flood of Noah, number 4, long transport distances of sediments. This one talks about how you can find the sandstone from Wyoming in the bottom of the Grand Canyon. Now, how would that happen? Well, the entire world is flooded, and then as God is, the continents are tearing apart, so the oceans are deepening. The rifts in the bottoms of the oceans are ripping apart and getting deeper. What's going to happen to the water on the land? It's going to run off real quickly into the oceans and collect in the oceans. When it does that, it's going to create little channels of rivulets, as the water's running off, right? You guys played in the sandbox, if you remember, and you build a little pool and you strike your finger through the wall of it and it all runs out. It creates kind of a channel there. Well, water that was hanging around in Wyoming, all of a sudden it had a relief valve, which is the Grand Canyon. So the water over the Great Plains area all drained out through the Grand Canyon in rapid time, channeling out the Grand Canyon quickly and also leaving sediment from all over the Midwest, which you can find in the bottom of the Grand Canyon. It's easily explained with Noah's flood, but if you don't believe in Noah's flood, how do you explain that? Evidence for the flood of Noah, number 6, whole rock layer sequences, right below that, number 5, rapid or no erosion between sediment layers. It's hard to see in that picture, but there's a straight line right through the middle of it. You see that straight line? On one side of it, I forget if it's below or above, it's sandstone, and the other side is shale. Evolutionists say that there was, a million years between those two layers of rock. Then how would you have a perfectly straight line between those two rock layers? If there's a million years between there, it would have eroded. There would be pits and valleys and spots where it would have worn down through wind and rain, and it would not be a straight line. You can't explain that unless those layers of rock were laid down rapidly one after another. And then evidence number 6 is the whole bent rock thing. So it's hard to see in this picture on this handout, but I showed you a picture on the screen. There's the bent rock thing. So that whole argument, again, you can't explain it unless you believe in Noah's flood. Okay, the one that says Noah's flood explains the ice age. I found this to be a very interesting article, so I printed it out for you. Climate scientists today come up with all sorts of models to try and predict weather. And so you can put in all these conditions into your climate model, and then you can dial it forward in time. And some of them do that and say, oh, the world's going to end in 17 years because we're going to all boil to death due to global warming. Some of them, whatever, the alarmists. Or you can dial it backwards and say, okay, we all know there's evidence of an ice age. Both creationists and evolutionists recognize an ice age. So you dial it back. These climate scientists cannot find the right set of conditions that, when dialed backward, produce an ice age. They can't find it. And it says here in this article, right in the middle on that front page, middle of that big paragraph, there are 60 different theories as to how the ice age came about. However, if you, and I'm flipping over on the other side, the first full paragraph at the top, When secular scientists run their computer models to explore the Ice Age, they find it difficult for any of their models to develop an ice age. But when they force their models to decrease the amount of sunshine by 6%, snow and ice builds up. What was part of Noah's flood? Volcanoes. What happened after, what was the volcano in Mount St. Helens? There was a streak of ash in the sky that came all the way clear to Michigan even. I remember that. Do you guys remember that? And it lasted for months.
I was out in Montana when it blew.
Yeah. So if all these volcanoes are going off as God is creating this catastrophe, if you decrease the amount of sunshine by only 6%, oh, now all of a sudden all these secular scientists, their models produce an ice age. Well, and it makes sense if you believe in Noah's flood, okay? And further, right after the time of Noah's flood, the firmament had just collapsed. The earth was still relatively, the water, I should say, was still relatively warm. It hadn't cooled off yet. With a thinner atmosphere around us, the earth is going to get cooler. But the water was still warm for, the next number of decades, century, whatever, after Noah's flood. So warm water, cool air. What's going to happen as the water, the moisture in the warmer oceans is evaporating and it hits the cooler atmosphere that's been cooled down because the firmament is not there? What happens? Snow. It explains an ice age. It's perfect. But secular scientists cannot explain it without putting in some of these conditions that would have been brought about by Noah's flood. Okay, this next one called Evidence for a Flood. And you can see that in the picture there, it's a picture of the Black Sea. Notice where this came from. Smithsonian Magazine. That's a secular source. That's not a Christian source by any means. There's these scientists who, probing and looking at the bottom of the Black Sea, have determined that the Black Sea used to be freshwater. But at a certain point in time, it became saltwater. And they find saltwater creatures buried and fossilized in the bottom of the Black Sea that come from the Mediterranean. That's where they come from. They weren't indigenous to the Black Sea. Further, there's other evidence that they dig down and they're looking at the bottom of the Black Sea and they find out that the Black Sea was much smaller. The shoreline was farther in and they can find evidence of civilizations kind of buried under the water, kind of closer in a smaller section. And they have come to the conclusion, if you read this whole article, they've come to the conclusion that the Black Sea and the Middle East was flooded at some point in time, such that the Mediterranean Sea backwashed up into the Black Sea. They claim it was a localized flood in the Middle East only. There's that argument again, okay? However, this is a secular source that is saying the Middle East was flooded back thousands of years ago. The whole Middle East got flooded. Well, yeah, it did. Not just the Middle East, the whole world. But I find this interesting because it's a secular source. Now, granted, they claim a localized flood, so there's a different argument that we have to make with them. But at least they agree there was a flood. So that's interesting too. Okay, last handout, one called Noah's Flood. It says chapter 5. This comes from a book called Unlocking the Mysteries of Genesis by Henry Morris. And it just kind of shows a little time frame here if you're interested. On the front it says chronology of the flood. Waters prevailed. So for 40 days rain fell. For 150 days total, the water kept rising, mostly from underground. At some point then, as the water peaked and then started coming back down, the ark came to rest on Ararat. They would have felt it. All of a sudden you bump, you hit, it's like a ship running aground. They sat there for 74 days, for 40 days. So after 74 days, the ark came to rest. Then after another 40 days, Noah sent out a raven. And remember what happened. The raven came back. Then he waited 7 more days, sent out a dove. Then another 7 days, sent out a dove. Then another 7 days and sent out a dove. And what happened to the dove the third time? Didn't come back, right? Then, maybe you don't realize this, and it's in the biblical account, Noah waited another 85 days for the earth to dry out enough that they could depart from the ark and start walking on, it's not muddy ground anymore. So 370 days total. So he was on the ark for a little over a year. It's quite a long time.
Quarantine.
Quarantine, yes, kind of like our quarantine today. Yeah, exactly.
But we're almost done then.
So there, yeah, right. We should be almost done. So there you go. There's lots of evidence for Noah's flood, including scientific evidence that cannot be explained unless you believe in Noah's flood. So I covered that in about 10 minutes shorter time than I covered on Tuesday and Wednesday, but we had to fit it in. So we got just, what, 2, 3, 4 minutes for a question or comment or two, or you guys got any thoughts, questions?
An awful lot of scientists are trying awfully hard to try to disprove the Bible. You know, and rather than just going by science, they're deciding what they believe and then setting out to prove it.
Yeah. You know, if there would be more scientists, and there are some who are objective and open-minded, but if some of the secular scientists, the non-Christian scientists, would just kind of say, okay, here's some scientific evidence. Marine creatures at the tops of mountains. Black Sea sediment that comes from the Mediterranean Sea. I mean, if they were just objective, you come to the conclusion, okay, there must have been some sort of flood. Now we can maybe dispute whether it was local or worldwide, but you have to come to the conclusion there was some sort of flood. But they're looking very hard to disprove the Bible rather than objectively look at the evidence we have today. Yeah. Yeah.
This all happened within a year or so, and the Earth was in 7 days, so they're looking millions of years. You know,
Yeah.
so they're, you know, that's quite a flaw.
Yeah, it is. It is.
There's too many votes.
And that's part of the reason why evolutionists claim millions and millions of years. Because then all of those mathematical laws of probability, well, it's so improbable that this could have happened. Yeah, but over 10 million years, anything can happen. You know, that's kind of their thinking. That if you claim it's long enough in time, that therefore you can get people to believe, well, anything can happen. You can overcome any mathematical improbability over millions of years. Other thoughts or questions? There is a lot of this evidence that we talked about, much more in depth and more that we didn't talk about, both inside of Noah's Ark at in the exhibit, as well as at the Creation Museum. You know, they're kind of sister exhibits. And I find it fascinating. I've been there twice. I can't wait to go a third time. Any other questions or comments? Well, okay. Easy enough.
Take your walking shoes off.
Yeah, take your walking shoes, right. Next week, we're going to talk about dinosaurs. Maybe of less interest to adults, I don't know, or maybe it is, but this is one that fascinates the kids. Well, as Christians, do we believe in dinosaurs? Yes, we do. They're in the Bible. What? They're in the Bible? I say, yeah, they're in the Bible. Let's talk about it. So we're going to talk about that next week, okay? Dinosaurs. All right, let's close with the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Thanks. Have a good day, everyone.
Very interesting. Thank you.
What?